September 4th, 1943, Hearne, Texas. The dust rose in lazy spirals under the late afternoon sun as Sergeant Fritz Hauser squinted through the chain-link fence at something his military training had never prepared him to understand. A 1,000-pound Brahma bull exploded from a wooden chute with a fury that seemed to violate the laws of physics, twisting its massive body mid-air while a man, just a man, no armor, no weapon, clung to its back with one hand raised toward the sky. 8 seconds. That's all he needed to survive. 8 seconds of controlled chaos that made absolutely no tactical sense whatsoever. Fritz leaned forward, his iron cross hanging beneath his POW uniform, and whispered to the officer beside him in German. "Cavalry extraction drill under simulated enemy fire?" The officer nodded slowly, pulling out a small notebook. It was the only explanation that made sense. Except it wasn't true. And in that moment of profound misunderstanding, Fritz was staring directly at the reason Germany would lose the war, he just didn't know it yet. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these forgotten stories from World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep digging through archives and bringing these moments to light. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We've got viewers from Oslo to São Paulo, from Adelaide to Anchorage, and it's honestly incredible to think we're all here, across time zones and continents, connected by these stories that refuse to stay buried. Now, let's get back to Texas, 1943, where several hundred German prisoners of war were about to have their entire worldview quietly dismantled by cowboys and livestock. Camp Hearne sprawled across 400 acres of former railroad land in Robertson County, Texas, population barely 10,000. By the summer of 1943, it had become one of the largest prisoner-of-war facilities in the American Southwest, housing nearly 5,000 German soldiers captured in North Africa. These weren't conscripts or rear echelon clerks. These were Rommel's Afrika Korps veterans, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over Tunisia, Panzer commanders who'd fought across 3 continents. Hard men. Professionals. They'd boarded transport ships in Casablanca expecting torture, execution squads, conditions matching the horror stories Wehrmacht propaganda had been feeding them for years about American brutality. What they got instead was white bread, real butter, beef stew with vegetables, and guards who seemed more interested in discussing baseball scores than demonstrating ideological superiority. The cognitive dissonance started immediately. Oberleutnant Heinrich Werner, a Luftwaffe pilot with 16 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary that first week, "The Americans are either exceptionally clever at psychological warfare, or they genuinely do not understand how to run a proper military prison. The guards chat. They smile. One offered me a cigarette and asked about my hometown. This is either brilliant deception or dangerous incompetence, and I cannot determine which." What Werner and his fellow prisoners couldn't grasp was something far simpler and far more threatening to their understanding of the war. Americans weren't trying to break them. They were just being American. And that difference, that fundamental philosophical gulf, would reveal itself most clearly on a Saturday afternoon at the Robertson County Fairgrounds. The announcement came during morning roll call on September 2nd. Prisoners with satisfactory conduct records could volunteer for a recreational excursion into town. Destination: a local cultural event. About 50 Germans climbed into canvas-covered trucks under light guard, assuming they were being paraded as defeated enemies for some war bond rally or propaganda exercise. The trucks rolled past cotton fields turning white in the late summer heat, past farmhouses with American flags hanging limp in the humid air, and pulled up to a dusty arena where hundreds of Texans had gathered around a large oval enclosure. Livestock pens lined one side. Men in enormous hats and tight denim stretched near what looked like reinforced wooden cages. A brass band played something upbeat and distinctly non-military. The Germans took their assigned seats in a roped-off section. The guards sat nearby, but they weren't watching the prisoners. They were watching the arena. And then a voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Robertson County Rodeo. A gate exploded open and chaos poured through. The bull came out spinning, kicking, its hooves throwing dirt 15 feet into the air while the rider's body whipped like he'd been hit by artillery concussion. The crowd roared. The German prisoners sat in stunned silence, their military minds racing to categorize what they were witnessing. Captain Werner Schultz, 21st Panzer Division, watched the bull twist in a corkscrew motion that seemed to defy anatomy. When the rider finally flew off and two mounted rescuers swooped in to extract him, Werner leaned back with visible satisfaction. "Cavalry maneuver training," he muttered. "Notice the coordination. The rescue riders know exactly when to move. This is months of preparation." Around him, heads nodded. It made perfect sense. The Americans were conducting military training exercises disguised as public entertainment, maintaining operational security while building civilian morale. Clever, really. Except it was completely, fundamentally wrong. The misunderstanding deepened with each event. When a cowboy roped a running calf, his horse planting its hooves while he sprinted forward to wrestle the animal down and tie 3 legs in under 10 seconds. The Germans saw reconnaissance and capture techniques. When broncos bucked and spun while riders clung one-handed to leather rigging, they saw cavalry conditioning for combat situations where equipment fails and mounts panic under fire. When teenage girls raced horses in tight cloverleaf patterns around barrels at breakneck speeds, leaning so far into turns their stirrups nearly scraped dirt, the Germans theorized it was messenger training or supply route practice with evasive maneuvers. The fact that women performed these drills baffled them, but they rationalized it as total war mobilization similar to Hitler Youth programs back home. Every event reinforced their interpretation. This was military preparation embedded into civilian culture, a decentralized training system that maintained combat readiness without formal military oversight. It was actually quite brilliant from a strategic standpoint, they thought. What none of them grasped, what their entire ideological framework prevented them from understanding, was that these weren't soldiers at all. These were ranch hands, farm workers, oil field roughnecks, and drifters who did this for $75 purses, engraved belt buckles, and the simple, inexplicable satisfaction of matching themselves against livestock and stopwatch. The danger was absolutely real. The skills were genuinely impressive. But the motivation? That was something the German military mind, conditioned by years of totalitarian discipline, simply could not process. Nobody ordered these men to climb onto those bulls. Nobody would court-martial them for refusing. They could walk away any time. But they didn't. And that voluntary embrace of risk, that radical personal agency disconnected from any collective benefit or state-sanctioned purpose that was America in microcosm. The Germans were staring directly at it and calling it military tactics. The cultural chasm ran deeper than language or geography. Every prisoner at that rodeo had been raised in a society where leisure followed strict institutional patterns, where physical risk required official approval, where public gatherings served state purposes. German athletic competitions happened in organized sports clubs with certifications and governing bodies. Horsemanship meant either military cavalry or aristocratic equestrian tradition. The concept that ordinary citizens would gather on a Saturday to watch other ordinary citizens risk traumatic injury for prize money and local glory voluntarily, recreationally, repeatedly, this simply didn't exist in their philosophical framework. It looked like chaos wearing a cowboy hat. Worse, it looked like evidence of American decadence and lack of discipline, exactly what Goebbels had been telling them for years. But here was the terrible irony they couldn't see yet. They were the ones behind barbed wire. These supposedly undisciplined cowboys lived free. That contradiction would haunt some of them for years. Back at camp that evening, the prisoners gathered in small groups to discuss what they'd witnessed. Oberleutnant Hans Weber, the Luftwaffe pilot, held court in his barracks while others sat on bunks taking notes. "The Americans have developed something unprecedented," he explained. "Instead of formal military academies requiring years of state investment, They embed combat preparation directly into civilian recreation. Those riders today, they're reservists maintaining readiness through competitive drills. The crowd creates social pressure to excel, replacing the need for military discipline. Prize money offsets training costs. It's decentralized, cost-effective, and maintains a cavalry reserve without active duty expenses. Several prisoners found this compelling. It explained the cheering, the prizes, the lack of uniforms. It even explained why Americans seemed so casual about military hierarchy. Their real training happened outside official channels. But one prisoner wasn't convinced. Ernst Friedman, a 42-year-old former university professor conscripted into the Wehrmacht, had studied American literature before the war. He'd read Steinbeck, knew about frontier mythology, had seen Buffalo Bill posters in Berlin museums. He cleared his throat carefully. "What if," he began, "this isn't military training at all? What if Americans simply enjoy watching dangerous activities the way we might attend a football match or boxing exhibition?" The silence that followed was profound. Another prisoner finally spoke. "Enjoy it." One rider limped away with blood streaming from his nose after hitting a fence rail. Another was clearly concussed. What kind of society considers voluntary trauma entertainment rather than either tragedy or necessary preparation for war? Friedman had no answer. He was right, but he couldn't explain why he was right in terms his comrades would accept. The disconnect was too vast. 3 weeks later, on September 25th, nearly 200 prisoners volunteered for the second rodeo trip. Word had spread through camp about the mysterious American training methods, and curiosity had infected even the skeptics. This time, the prisoners arrived with notebooks, sketching diagrams, attempting to decode what they still believed were covert military methodologies hidden in plain sight. They watched more carefully now, noting details. The opening ceremony featured cowboys carrying American and Texas flags in precise formation, while the national anthem played textbook military pageantry. Then a woman in her 50s wearing turquoise jewelry announced the evening's program through a crackling loudspeaker. Her casual authority baffled several prisoners. Why was a civilian woman coordinating military exercises? One theorized she might be a psychological operations officer using a cover identity. The alternative, that she was simply the rodeo secretary, a volunteer position, was too mundane to consider. The bareback bronc riding started, and contestant number 7 drew a horse called Widowmaker. The chute opened and Widowmaker launched straight vertical, came down stiff-legged, then twisted midair in a corkscrew that seemed to violate skeletal possibility. The kid flew off after 4 seconds, landing hard on his shoulder. Medical staff rushed over. The cowboy waved them off, grabbed his hat from the dirt, and limped away, grinning through obvious pain. He high-fived his friends near the chutes and immediately started discussing his next ride. Captain Werner Schultz watched this exchange and felt something shift in his understanding. What military value existed in riding a horse specifically bred to throw you? Cavalry training required controlled environments, progressive skill development, minimizing unnecessary casualties. This was the opposite. This was maximizing risk for no apparent strategic gain. He said nothing to his companions, but doubt had taken root. The truth emerged gradually, pieced together through fragments. A camp guard named Tommy Henderson, a corporal from Fort Worth, spent an afternoon in late October explaining rodeo history to a group of fascinated Germans. He told them about the Old West, about cattle drives from Texas to Kansas railheads, about how ranch hands competed during downtime to test their skills. He explained that rodeo evolved from these informal competitions into organized events in the 1880s and 1890s, with the first official rodeo in Prescott, Arizona, in 1888. None of it, absolutely none of it, had anything to do with military preparation. It was purely about celebrating working cowboy culture and testing individual skill against livestock and stopwatch. The Germans listened with the expression of men watching their entire interpretive framework collapse. These weren't soldiers. These were civilians who chose danger voluntarily because the challenge itself held meaning beyond external validation. The letters prisoners sent home, all censored and read by American officials, captured their evolving understanding. Franz Burmeister, a Bavarian corporal, wrote to his wife in November 1943, "The Americans have a form of entertainment where men ride wild animals for money and glory. At first we believed it was military training, but I have learned it is simply their way. They seem to enjoy danger for its own sake, which explains much about how they fight." Another prisoner, Ludwig Stein, wrote more philosophically, "These Texans possess a frontier spirit we Germans have long forgotten. They value individual courage over collective obedience. I begin to understand why they resist our new order so fiercely. It is not that they are strong in the way we define strength. It is that they define strength differently, and perhaps their definition is more dangerous than ours." Heinrich Werner, the Luftwaffe pilot, would remember the rodeo revelation with perfect clarity 40 years later when German television interviewed him for a 1983 documentary about POW experiences. "When I finally understood that these cowboys were not soldiers," he said, his voice still carrying traces of that original shock, "that nobody ordered them to risk their necks, that they did it for personal pride and $75 purses, I realized I had never truly understood America. We thought they were soft, undisciplined, obsessed with comfort and pleasure. But a nation where ordinary men voluntarily climb onto 1,800-pound bulls for sport? That is not a soft nation. That is perhaps a crazy nation, but it is not weak. And we were losing to them." The broader lesson took longer to penetrate, but it was unavoidable. Camp Hearn operated under Geneva Convention standards that would have seemed absurdly lenient to anyone familiar with POW conditions in Europe or the Pacific. German prisoners ate better than German civilians back home, earned wages for farm labor, attended movies and concerts, played soccer on weekends, and received mail from families. Of approximately 425,000 German POWs held in the United States during World War II, fewer than 1% died in captivity, mostly from accidents or illness. Meanwhile, of the roughly 3 million Soviet prisoners held by Germany, nearly 58% died from starvation, exposure, execution, or forced labor in conditions designed to kill. American prisoners held by Japan faced mortality rates exceeding 27%. The contrast was so stark it bordered on incomprehensible. Some prisoners experienced profound guilt. How could they watch movies while their comrades died on the Eastern Front? How could they eat well while German children starved under Allied bombing? Letters from home described worsening conditions, destroyed cities, mounting casualties. The disconnect created cognitive dissonance that resolved differently for different men. Some retreated into denial. Some fell into depression. A few attempted suicide, unable to reconcile comfortable captivity with duty to a failing homeland. But others, particularly those who'd witnessed the war's trajectory firsthand in North Africa, began fundamentally reassessing their assumptions about who would ultimately prevail and why. The rodeo became a symbol of that reassessment, a microcosm of something larger and more threatening than military tactics. The war ended in May 1945, but prisoners didn't go home immediately. Labor shortages continued, and nobody was eager to return thousands of men to a Germany that lay in ruins, divided between Soviet and Western occupation zones. The last prisoners at Camp Hearn finally shipped out in late 1945 and early 1946, loaded onto trains heading to East Coast ports, then crammed into Liberty ships sailing back across the Atlantic. Many returned to find their hometowns bombed into rubble, their families scattered or dead, their country transformed beyond recognition. The Germany they'd left as conquering warriors no longer existed. But something unexpected happened in the decades that followed. Some former prisoners maintained correspondence with Texas families they'd met during work details or through church programs. A few even returned as immigrants once restrictions lifted in the 1950s, settling in Texas and building new lives in the place where they'd once been imprisoned. Hans Miller, who'd picked cotton near Hearne as a POW, returned in 1953 with his new wife and opened a bakery in Houston using skills he'd refined in the camp bakery. Werner Schultz, the captain who'd theorized about cavalry training, immigrated to Austin in 1958 and taught German literature at the University of Texas for 23 years. These men represented a tiny minority. Most former POWs had no desire to return to their place of captivity, but their choices spoke volumes about the unusual nature of their wartime experience. In 1976, over 60 former Camp Hearne prisoners organized a reunion in Germany, sharing stories about the rodeos, about learning English, about Texas heat and American jazz piped through camp loudspeakers. Several mentioned that their time as POWs had been the safest period of their entire war. One veteran summed it up bluntly, "I survived the war because the Americans captured me in Tunisia, instead of the Russians capturing me at Stalingrad." In 1982, 3 former prisoners made the journey back to Hearne. They were elderly men now, in their 60s and 70s, accompanied by families who'd heard their stories for decades but never quite believed them. They walked the overgrown site where Camp Hearne once stood, trying to orient themselves by remaining concrete foundations. They visited local farms where they'd worked 40 years earlier. And yes, they attended a rodeo this time, fully understanding what they were watching, laughing at their younger selves who'd mistaken bull riders for military cavalry.